Okay, hi everyone. This is Daniel Karupkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario in Canada on behalf of webyeshiva.org, where we are studying Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, the Rambam's Moreh Nevukhim. We've been doing this for quite some time, and we are in section 3, chapter 12. That's what we're going to be doing today. If you'd like to be able to follow along the text in the Shlomo Pines edition, which is what we've been using for this entire series, you can. Chapter 12 is a little bit more of a lengthy chapter, very verbose. It's on page 441 is where it starts. We're going to try, despite the length of the chapter, we're going to try to get through all of it today. It strikes me that the Rambam has used a lot of language, a lot of verbiage in this chapter to get across points that are probably much more esoteric than we truly appreciate. But if we were to try to synopsize the whole theme of this chapter, it is to sort of get across the point that there is there is far less evil in the world than people think. That's what I meant to write. There is far less evil in the world than people think. And the premise that the Rambam is working under is that God is an all perfect and all good and all kind being. And therefore, all that emanates from God must be good. Whenever we confront evil, and we try to give a working definition of evil in the past couple of discussions that we've had on this topic, and that is that evil really doesn't mean just human evil. That was, malicious things that are perpetrated by human beings, but evil could mean any bad things that happen in the world, such as natural catastrophes, people getting stricken by illness, congenital defects, all of the things that we approach from our human perspective as being tragic and undesirable. That's the existence of evil in the world. The Rambam had said that this does not come as a direct result of God, because God does not directly produce that which is antithetical to him, to his essence. And instead, it is that God created matter. Matter is a creation of God that is subject to corruption, breakdown, and rejuvenation. And as such, we perceive anything that breaks down and is defective as being part of some kind of evil in the world, when in reality, it is part of a divine system which, taken in its totality, is something that is very good. And so that's really the approach that the Rambam is going to be taking throughout this chapter. And so for the purposes of our discussion today, and because there's so much verbiage, I'm going to share with you my screen. Those of you who are listening to this on audio without being able to see a screen, please note that you can always download the handout either from webyeshiva.org's description of this course for today, or from the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim. And again, as a synopsis, in defense of God, from whom emanates only kindness and goodness, the argument that people make that there is more evil than good in the world is false. The Rambam opens by telling us that most religions contain literature that suggests that life is filled with more evil than good. This is because in the temporal world, there is inevitable flaw and corruption. And people therefore look out and they see that life is filled with far more suffering than it is with joy and pleasure. The Rambam wants to explain that that is a misconception of the human condition. He quotes a philosopher of the 10th century named Al-Razi. He is actually more known for his mastery of medicine than he was known for his philosophy. But the Rambam quotes a philosophy work that Al-Razi wrote that is not extant, at least not in its full form, to us today. It's been lost to the sands of time. But he quotes Al-Razi as saying that if you look at the average individual human life, it is filled with far more suffering and tragedy than well-being and happiness. This indicates that life is ultimately a punishment to man. Some have actually given the following metaphor, that if you look at the night sky, you see points of light, the stars, but there's far more darkness that surrounds the stars than there is the light that emanates from the stars. And that seems to be, at least from many people's perspective, the human condition. We go through a journey called life, and the mundaneness of everyday living is the standard. It is the unusual or the exceptional where we experience milestones that give us great joy, such as, getting married, having a child, and going through like extremely joyous experiences. And the rest of life is tedious, it's difficult, it's burdensome, especially when we have to contend with illness or care for someone who has a disability. It can be very, very difficult and tedious. And therefore, man perceives that there is more evil in this world than there is goodness. Now, I want to make a very, very small point that the Rambam does not make in this chapter, and that is our sages seem to corroborate the statement of Al-Razi. I find it fascinating and very curious, and somewhat bothersome as well, that the Rambam does not at all contend with the theology of the rabbinic sages in this chapter at all. Perhaps he will do so somewhere down the road in his struggles with dealing with evil. But in this particular chapter, he is speaking really only as a philosopher, and the only citations that he has from Jewish texts are Torah shebichtav, are from the Tanakh itself, from the actual Bible, but not from the words of the sages. Now, I do want to point out that the sages seem to echo Al-Razi when they say in Tractate Eruvin, it's a much lengthier Gemara, that there was a dispute for 2.5 years between the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel, whether it is better for man to never have been born than to have been born. And the conclusion after this years-long struggle theologically between these two academies was that the conclusion was Noach lo la'adam shelo nivra yoter mishen nivra. It is better for a man to never have been created than to have been created. But now that he has been created, let him engage in Torah and ma'asim tovim and good deeds, because he has no choice. He came into this world against his will. Now, that certainly seems to indicate that there's more evil in the world than there is good. And therefore, if a person were to be given a choice as a disembodied soul, the person would probably choose not to come into this world. And yet the Rambam is going to rail against that kind of attitude. So let's see where he goes with this. And I want you to try, if you can, keep that statement of the sages in mind, and we'll come back to it at the very end. And he says that this attitude, that there is more evil in the world than good, flies in the face of all that we know about God and his absolute kindness and goodness. Only kindness and goodness can emanate from such a God. And as just to recall, the Rambam's whole worldview is such that a proper knowledge of God brings man to perfection. So for the human being to have a flawed perception of a God that proliferates more evil than good in the world really denies the individual the ability to intellectually apprehend God properly. And that's really why the Rambam feels that we must dispel this myth. And he says this mistaken approach is predicated on a basic flaw, only observing the individual human condition without taking into account the totality of creation. When a person only looks at the individual life, the individual lifespan, he's not panning out the camera far enough to get a panoramic view of all of creation. The more panoramic the view of creation, contends the Rambam, the more that the human mind is capable of understanding that everything that is in this world is truly good. So humans have a human-centric view of the world, and whenever something happens that is contrary to the individual human's wishes, the human being views this as evil. But in reality, man is a very minuscule component of the larger creation. And this is where the Rambam really goes against the whole school of theology and Jewish thought, which is that man is the crowning achievement of creation. The Rambam in our chapter really plays that down, and you'll see in a moment why he does. First of all, he says, consider all else that exists within creation that is perfect. The angels, the spheres, the stars, the elements, the minerals, the plants, the animal kingdom. Everything seems to be structured beautifully with very, very little defect, especially when you get into the higher plane of existence, when you go into the celestial realm and you go into the angelic realm, you find no flaw whatsoever. Now, of course, this is somewhat of a of perhaps a strained argument, because man can only study the celestial realm from a very, very great distance, and we don't have a perfect understanding of the celestial realm. And if you remember from section 2, the Rambam had addressed the fact that there are certain anomalies mathematically that exist in the astronomical celestial realm. All of that notwithstanding, the Rambam says that everything that we can observe seems to be without flaw. And it's only when we really limit our view to only the human condition of an individual life that we find we seem to fixate more on all of the things that go wrong. As we will see, human beings, by contrast, are largely responsible for their own tragic state, such as the person who eats bad food and is struck with leprosy, or the person who overindulges in copulation and goes blind. The Rambam is going to expand on this idea, but he sort of gives us an introduction to his entire worldview as far as why evil exists in the human condition, and it's because of man's free will. We make poor choices, and a result of those poor choices is poor quality of life. And we're going to get to that in a moment. But this is one of the tactics that the Rambam uses in order to deflect evil and flaw from God. God gave man free will. I go ahead and I choose poorly, and I suffer the consequences of those poor choices. How can I say that God is responsible for creating a world that is filled with evil when I am the one who made those choices that caused those evils to occur in my life? Other components of creation, therefore, by contrast, do not chart their own paths and are thus not as riddled with evil and flaw and corruption. And then the Rambam writes that in reality, existent individuals of either humanity or animals who are subject to corruption and suffering are of very little value in comparison to the whole that exists and endures. The Rambam then will quotes 4 verses from Tanakh that confirm this idea. He explains, and we say some of these verses over the high holidays because we want to try and put ourselves in the proper perspective that we're not the center of the universe, and therefore we throw ourselves at God's mercy. Adam lahevel dama, that man is like nothingness. Yamav kitzel over, his days are like a fleeting shadow. That is what King David writes in the Psalm 144. Or in the book of Job, first he quotes from chapter 25, Af ki enosh rima uven adam tolea, that man is but a worm and a maggot. Or in Job chapter 4, Af shochene vatechomer, asher be'afar yisodam, that those people who live in clay houses that are come from the dust, Yedaku'um lifnei ash, they are destroyed through decay. In other words, we have very, very little substance to us. We're very fragile, meaningless creatures. Isaiah chapter 40, Hein goyim kemar midali ucheshachak moznayim nechshavu. All of the nations of the world, even put all together, are like the scrapings of the scale. They are very, very insignificant, insubstantial. Hein iyim kadakitol. Thus, a man should not make the mistake of thinking that what exists is an existence only for the sake of him as an individual. Man is quite insignificant, and the more you individuate man, the even more insignificant the individual becomes. Now, of course, this is certainly not in keeping with a whole school of theology within Judaism that focuses on the gadluta adam, that man should say, Bishvili nivra ha'olam, the world was created for my sake. After all, if God didn't need me in this world, he wouldn't have created me. But the Rambam is not taking that approach in this chapter. We view man as being quite inferior to other existence in God's creation, which are not subject to flaw and suffering, such as the spheres, the stars, and the angels, as he had discussed. And just to quote the Pines text directly, man is merely the most noble among the things that are subject to generation, namely in this our lowly world. I mean to say that he is the noblest thing that is composed of the elements or matter. And that's what the Rambam wants to say. He says, yes, is man an important creation? Yes, but only by comparison to the other creations that are within man's environment. But if you take the totality of creation that far transcends our terrestrial realm, you will note that there are certain disembodied creations of God, things that are not weighed down, so to speak, or are not corrupted by being material creations, such as angels and celestial spheres and intelligences. These are far more perfect and certainly not as riddled with flaw as man. His superiority is only in relation to other material things. Implied in this is that man is created in God's image, going back to the very first chapter of Moreh Nevukhim. The majority of evils that befall him are thus his own fault. And some verses, two verses that we'll quote now, that bear out that man is responsible for his own misfortune. First, from Parshat Ha'azinu, from the book of Deuteronomy, Shichet lo banav mumam. Did God create man's degradation or destruction? No. It is God's children who self-inflicted their own injury. Dor ikesh ufetal tol, a corrupted and perverted generation. Or from the book of Proverbs, Mishlei, Ivelet Adam Tisalef Darko, it is the corruption of man that will pervert his pathway. Va'al Hashem Yizaf Libo, and he'll blame God for all of the things that go wrong in his life, when in reality man has caused it himself. Now, how do we explain this? How do we say that man is responsible for all the things that go wrong? Aren't we witness to natural calamities and to congenital defects? How can you blame man himself for all of those defects? So to explain, we should appreciate, the Rambam says, that all the evils that befall man fall under one of three categories, and each category of evil is where man produces his own evil. Now that at face value does not seem to be accurate, but let's take a look and see how the Rambam breaks this down. We're on page 443 in the Pines edition now, and we're just paraphrasing it for the sake of time. The first evil of the three, the first category of evil, is the evil that comes as a result of man being a material being, which by definition means that he is subject to coming to be and passing away. And essentially what the Rambam is saying is that man's very makeup makes him subject to defect, flaw, and corruption. So that's the first kind of evil that man confronts in the world. Yes, are people born with congenital defects? What greater defect is man born with than his subjectivity to mortality? Every human being, from the moment that they are born, is in the process of dying. And if so, this is the attitude of the Rambam and of so many philosophers. From the moment we come into this world as a newborn baby, we have started the process of death, because the body, by its very nature, is meant to not be immortal, is meant to not last forever. Mankind, because of his material aspect, is constantly in a state of breaking down, so that the ingredients that have broken down can be reconstructed into new life and to new organisms. This also can be the case that man is subject to breakdown because of external factors such as bad air, fire, landslides, natural disasters, and so forth. Things that are in a person's environment that cause him to be injured or to die. Those are things that man is subject to simply because man is a composite of both body and soul. It is the material aspect of man that causes him to be subject to this kind of decomposition and disintegration. And we talked extensively about this both in chapter 8 and in chapter 10 of this section. We have already explained that matter by its very nature is subject to constant change, always divesting itself from one form to take on the form of another. You simply cannot escape the fact that if you are part of this material world, you will eventually disintegrate and pass away. And for man to blame that on God and say that God is evil for causing material things to fall apart and to disintegrate is really to not appreciate that there's an overall system. You can call it the circle of life, whatever you want to call it, but it is this world is comprised of constant decomposition and rejuvenation and regeneration. As a matter of fact, the only way that there can be coming to be of new material organisms is through the passing away of others. As we said, The way the Rambam looks at matter and form is that matter is constantly seeking to divest itself of a certain form so that it can adhere to a higher level of form. In this way, even the passing away of material organisms is part of the kindness and the good that invariably emanates from God. He who seeks immortality thus also seeks to be the only specimen of his species, just as there is only one species of celestial sphere or angel, because once you are divested of matter, each species is sui generis. There is no reproduction that exists in the angelic realm or in the celestial realm. The fact that we reproduce is by force, is necessary simply because we are subject to decomposition. But it is the very nature of matter that causes it to decompose, which also causes it to reproduce or recreate itself by matter reconstituting itself into new form. If a person were to seek immortality and say that I would like to be divested of the temporary nature of matter, then he's also suggesting that I would like to no longer be able to reproduce. I would like to be the only existent being of my species. When taking mankind in totality, one will note that, putting aside the breaking down of individuals over time, the evils that befall the totality of mankind are very few and occur only seldom. And the argument that the Rambam makes, for you will find cities existing for thousands of years that have never been flooded or burned. Yes, do individual human beings die and get sick, etc., etc.? Of course. But take the totality of mankind, and you will note that mankind is a constantly perpetuating machine of existence. And when taken in totality, the species of humanity, it is quite a well-functioning machine of constant death and reproduction. Also, the majority of people are born without defects, and only a small minority are born with serious abnormalities or defects. The Rambam seems to be somewhat exaggerative on this point because he says it's only like 1 in several thousand that people have defects. That doesn't seem to be the case in our world today. But he does so for the effect of trying to impress upon us that Hashem is not responsible for all of the evils that we encounter, because it's really we're not panning out far enough with our cameras to be able to see the totality of creation. But it turns out that through the act of human reproduction, mankind produces its own flawed existence in its offspring. And that's really the punchline. All three evils, says the Rambam, are man's own doing. How does man create the flaw that exists in matter? Because we choose to reproduce. It is through the sperm of the male and the egg of the female that are both material commodities that are part of the material realm, that is the result, the very basis for why human beings come into the world and start dying as soon as they are born, right? Mankind, because of his material essence, contributes to the breakdown of his offspring. And so we are part of this process that contributes to what we perceive to be evil. So it's really our own doing, so to speak, looked at from this perspective, because we contribute to the reproduction of material organisms, that we are the cause of our own breakdown. Now we're going to get more into really, and if you have difficulty with that argument, you'll have less difficulty with the next two arguments. The second category of evil is the evils that men afflict upon each other, such as murder and theft and other kinds of injury that we inflict upon each other, either during peace or during war. These evils are greater than the first. In other words, there is far more violence that is perpetrated against man by man than violence that is perpetrated against man by natural phenomena, but are not attributable to God's creation of matter, but rather to man's free will. That is to say, an evil also originating with man. Man also has no recourse to save himself from these evils, I grant you, says the Rambam. But despite that, the vast majority of humanity does not suffer at the hands of other humans, to wit, and we're just quoting directly, there is no city existing anywhere in the whole world in which evil of this kind is in any way widespread and predominant among the inhabitants of that city. So perhaps you could have argued during the whole Black Lives Matter, complete breakdown of whole cities like Seattle or other places in the world where there was just complete lawlessness, it wasn't as chaotic as people portrayed it. In other words, even within these lawless cities, where the police were completely shut down, there still was not absolute pandemonium where every single member of the city, it was really only a small minority of individuals who were subjected to this kind of violence at the hands of other human beings. But even in times of lawlessness and war, the vast majority of humanity remains protected and remains secure. The only time this evil is more common is during war, which is also a minority of the entirety of human history. So that is the second evil. And that's certainly more understandable how this kind of evil is perpetrated by man himself and cannot be sort of pinned on God as being God's fault. And the third evil, which is most clearly manifest as being man's fault, is the most common evil, is that which is self-inflicted as a result of man's free will, poor choices. And to quote the Rambam, all men lament over evils of this kind, and it is only seldom that you find one who is not guilty of having brought them upon himself. Some verses that bear out how man is responsible for his own self-inflicted injuries. The first one is from the verse in Malachi, Ve'ata chaluna pnei kel vichanenu. Seek out and supplicate before God, because miyadchem ha'itazot, because all of the things that have befallen you, that you feel sick and you feel that you have been stricken with calamity and tragedy, is really all your fault, is essentially what God says. As it says in Proverbs chapter 6, No'ef isha chasar lev, just as a man who commits adultery is ignorant, mashchit nafsho hu ya'asena, he's really destroying his own soul. Or in Proverbs chapter 19, Ivelet Adam Tisalef Darko, that it is the corruption of man that will pervert his way, like we quoted above. Va'al Hashem Yizaf Libo, and he'll end up blaming God. Or a verse in Kohelet. It's also not clear to me why sometimes the Rambam repeats certain verses in different parts of this chapter. Kohelet, chapter 7, Levad re'ezeh matzati asher asaha Elokim et Adam yashar. Behold, King Solomon says, I've found this phenomenon to be true. God makes man upright. Vehema vikshu chishavonot rabim, but man seeks out different ways to corrupt himself. In other words, man, either by making poor choices that affect his bodily health directly, or by sinning and acting immorally, which cause damage to his soul, man is responsible for these self-inflicted wounds. Or as it says in Job, Ki lo yetzei me'afar aven o me'adama lo yitzmach amal, that from the earth itself, nothing treacherous emerges. Ki adam la'amal yulad, man is born to commit treachery against himself. Rambam here translates the word amal as something negative. The evils that all these verses refer to are human vices: lust for food, drink, and sex, and overindulging in these things to excess, which brings damage and corruption to his body and his soul. With regard to bodily damage, it is self-evident that if a person eats too much or eats or drinks bad food or bad drink, person can become obese, person can become an alcoholic, and cause himself to become sickly because of so many different diseases that arise through overindulgence of food and drink. Person who overindulges in sexual activity becomes an addict and can also cause himself all different kinds of physical ailments by weakening his body. With regard to his spiritual character, in other words, the makeup of his midot, of his moral fiber, when a person overindulges in these kinds of indulgences and these kinds of lusts, a breakdown of one's moral character becomes manifest in two ways. Number one, the soul is adversely affected by a compromised body, since the two are inexorably connected. That is to say, when you have an unhealthy body, you have an unhealthy soul. And the unhealthiness of one's soul is manifest in one's character traits. And number two, Once the soul becomes accustomed to certain indulgences, it becomes addicted. The Rambam doesn't use that term addicted. That's my interpretation of what he's describing. Addiction, by definition, is something that can never be fully sated. And so the person who becomes overindulgent ends up filling his life with this endless pursuit of more and more indulgence. And that sort of is descriptive of someone who has a flawed spiritual character, because he can't be satisfied with anything in life. And such a person is going to look at life as being filled with evil, because he can never attain what he sets himself out to attain. Why, God? Why did you do this to me? Why didn't you make me wealthy the way I wanted? Why didn't you give me this when I asked for it, et cetera, et cetera? For example, if a person lusts for silver, he next craves gold. If he lusts for fine crystal, he next craves emeralds and rubies. For this reason, every person who becomes addicted to material things is perpetually sad, feeling that they haven't achieved their goals and they feel that God has let them down. Our sages say, and the Rambam again does not quote anything from our sages in this chapter, but I just thought this was apt for this section of our text. Ein adam yotze min ha'olam v'chatzi ta'avato biyado, as the Midrash writes, that when a person is ready to leave this world, he hasn't satisfied even half of his desires. That is human nature. Because of these lusts and addictions, people take risks, such as sea voyages and serving kings, in order to obtain their desires. And often calamity ensues as a result. So part of the damage that happens to us is that we will take unnecessary risks to obtain luxuries in life. And sometimes those risks don't turn out good, and we end up injuring ourselves, or worse, because we were willing to take risks, because we were thrill seekers, because we needed to make more money, etc. When such a person is stricken by misfortunes, instead of attaining his goals, he complains to God and perceives injustice in that God did not help him attain his goals, such as wealth, wine, and women. As if the whole purpose of existence, states the Rambam, consisted merely in the pleasure of such an ignoble man, as if the human being expects God to move heaven and earth to satisfy my lusts. It is no surprise then that people are so unhappy in life, since their desires can never be fulfilled, since lust is a bottomless pit. Man then blames God for these quote unquote evils. We're almost done with the chapter. By contrast, the Rambam writes, and this is where he gets towards the end of his chapter, towards the very last page of chapter 12, and we are now on page 447, almost towards the end. When wise men recognize that this world is imbued with great wisdom and great goodness, David thus said in Psalms 25, Kol orchot Hashem chesed ve'emet, all of God's pathways are kindness and truth, l'notzrei v'rito ve'edotav, for those who uphold his covenant and his laws. In other words, for those who are not consumed by their lust, but rather abide by the nature of that which exists. In other words, they understand the nature of the world and don't try to overdo it. They keep the commandments of the Torah and know the ends of both. Such people apprehend clearly the excellency and true reality of the whole. In other words, if a person takes a moderate approach to indulgence in this world and understands the rules of the game as far as not overindulging in things that will only end up harming oneself, and to the end that he observes the commandments, which, according to the Rambam, at least in part, are geared towards pulling man away from his lusts, then such a person will be able to appreciate the world as it's good for its goodness and its truth and its kindness. These men seek the objective of existence, which is knowledge, not physical indulgence. They only seek out that which is necessary for subsistence, meager bread and clothing, as per Genesis chapter 28. Life is much easier and pleasurable without the pursuit of luxuries. By contrast, quote, when one endeavors to seek what is unnecessary, it becomes difficult to find even what is necessary, since one spends his resources on luxuries, losing his money that he should have used for the essentials. Consider, this is point number 5 in our outline, consider how God made his world in such a way that the more essential a commodity is for one's survival, the more plentiful and accessible it is. The last 2 points that the Rambam is going to make in our chapter is to try and demonstrate, using 2 arguments, that this world is a beautiful world and it is a just world. And the first argument that the Rambam makes to demonstrate how this world is a good world, a kind world, that God really structured this world in a perfect way, in a benevolent way, is to look at how it seems to just be perfectly, it seems to perfectly work out that the more necessary a commodity is for an organism's survival, the more plentiful that resource is. And here are the examples that the Rambam gives. He says, air is the most necessary component to any organic organism's survival. And it happens to be the most plentiful element or resource that is available to man. Air, for the most part, is free. The second most necessary component for human survival is water, hydration. And that too is in abundant supply, not as much as air, because a human being could survive a couple of days without water, not more than that. And therefore, water is in abundant supply throughout the world. And finally, food, which is also necessary for human survival, but not as necessary as air and water, is to be found with less abundant supply, but nonetheless, the more necessary the food item is for man's survival, the more it is found in the natural world. And this is the way that God structured the world, because he wants all of his creatures to continue existing. Regarding, however, luxuries like musk, amber, and precious stones, the Rambam writes, they are in rarer supply because they are only necessary in rare occasions for medication, and even then substitutes are available from the herbs and the earths. We have thus demonstrated God's kindness and goodness. Regarding his justice, this is also manifest. And so therefore, this is the second argument of the Rambam, that not only does God act benevolently by giving us the things we need the most in the most abundant manner, but he is also a just God. There is no organism within any species of living creatures that has inherent advantage of an additional faculty or limb above other specimens of the same species. And here the Rambam is pointing out that even though there is something within the human condition that makes us look at other people with jealousy, saying he has more than I have, and not being happy because of that. But when you look out at the animal kingdom and you look out at the plant kingdom, you will notice that with very rare exception, such as cases of unusual mutation, every single member of a particular species is the same. The leopard has the same spots as every other leopard. The lion has the same ferocity as every other lion. The insect of a particular species is exactly like its fellow insect, and it is the same through the animal kingdom, because God gives each species its due in order to be able to survive. Only rarely do you find a mutation within a living creature that places it at a disadvantage in comparison to other organisms of its species. In all the animal kingdom, therefore, we don't find that individual organisms are superior or inferior to other members of their species. Why then do we see disparity among human beings, where some have more wealth and some less? Is this not unjust? After all, that's the source of so much unhappiness in man's perception of evil. And to that, the Rambam gives a resounding no. I quote, "He who has obtained these luxuries has not gained thereby an increment in his substance. He has only obtained a false imagining or plaything. If a person has more money, if a person has more stuff, if a person has more wealth, that does not inherently make that person better. And therefore, human beings are no different from every other organism in the animal kingdom. We all have basically the same. Some people may be taller, some people may be shorter, some people may be better looking, some people less good looking. But when you think about the inherent substance of each human being, we are essentially the same. As the Torah states regarding the manna in Exodus, "Velo ha'edif hamarbeh v'hamamit lo hechsir," that it was not possible, because the manna came from heaven, and it was a demonstration of God's benevolent system for anyone to have more than the other. And that's the way God really structured his world. There is the illusion of some people with more and some people with less, but in this context, the Rambam says it is merely an illusion. This is the general rule of an existence, despite there being occasional anomalies. And finally, point number 7, when one contemplates these two ideas, God's great kindness in providing the more basic essentials in greater abundance. And number two, God's great justice in not endowing individuals of the same species with more or less. Man realizes God's greatness and God's kindness to all his creatures. Scripture thus states, Hatsur tamim pa'alo ki chol derachav mishpat, that God is pure and everything that he does is complete justice. And he quotes another two verses. We'll just quote the last verse from Psalms 145. Tov Hashem lakol v'rachamov al kol ma'asav, that God is good to all and his compassion is upon all of his creatures. For his bringing us into existence is absolutely the great good, as we have made clear, not like Al-Razi said that it would have been better for man to never have been created. And the creation of the force that governs living beings according to their nature is an indication of his mercifulness upon them, as we have made clear that God gives every creature its due. So what then and this is how the Rambam ends his chapter. What then are we to do? And with this we'll conclude with the statement of the sages, Noach lo la'adam shelo nivra yoter mishen nivra. It would have been better for man to have never been created than to have been created. Is that not consistent with the fallacious statement of the philosopher Al-Razi? The Rambam does not answer this question because he never quotes from the sages in this chapter. Allow me, however, to suggest that, like many of the commentaries say, the Talmud does not say tov lo la'adam. It would have been better for a man, tov, it would have been good, or better goodness for man never to have been created than to have been created. The word is noach lo la'adam. It would have been easier for man to never have been created than to have been created. In other words, God placed a veil over our eyes when he placed us in this world. And that veil causes us to perceive things as being difficult, as being painful, as being challenging to our lives. And therefore, if we were given a choice as a disembodied soul and we were shown all of the challenges and travails and pains that we would have to endure by going through this life, we might have said it would be so much easier remaining a disembodied soul. But is it better to be disembodied than to have come into the world? Not at all. Because by going through this world and lifting the veil from off our eyes, which is what the Rambam is seeking to do in this chapter, we can actually look out upon the world and say, what a beautiful world we live in. And what a benevolent God God is by having given us this majestic world that, as long as we pan out our cameras wide enough, we will see only great beauty and great goodness. Well, that's the chapter for today. There's so much to discuss as far as whether one could present, let's say, challenges to some of the arguments that the Rambam placed in this work. One of the most basic arguments you could make is God ultimately is responsible for the flaws that exist within the material world. But that being said, the Rambam's response is that it's only flawed if you view it from a very, very limited lens. If you look at the entire system, it actually is a system that God wants to work in the way that it does, where things break down and then they reproduce. So there's so much more to discuss, but we're out of time. Let's keep in mind that this is an unfinished discussion about the existence of evil, and we will continue this discussion with the ensuing chapters. We'll see you next time. I hope everyone has a great week and look forward to our next discussion together. Take care, everybody.